In this lecture, we talk about some of the information from chapter 14, which focuses on human variation and genetics. We'll jump right to a discussion on race, since this is included in this week's reading. So, generally speaking, when you ask just a random person on the street, what is race, they will give a folk or vernacular description, which is often entails something along the lines of a group of people who resemble one another, and it's usually associated with appearance, skin color, hair type, and eyes. However, this is a cultural definition of race, and so today we're going to be debunking a lot of the myths surrounding race. Biologically speaking, so first of all, I'm just going to give you sort of the take-home message. Race does not exist on a biological level. If we are thinking of it through pure biological terms, the definition would be populations with a very high level of genetic similarity. So nowadays, this is how biologists use the term race to discuss or describe populations with a high level of genetic similarity. Races in this sense are likely to be small, isolated, highly inbred, and because this notion of race is based on genetic similarity, and similarity comes in degrees, it actually follows that there are no sharp dividing lines between races, which I'll show you in a couple of slides. In fact, the biological, or more specifically, the genomic idea of race is best seen as a rough and ready shorthand for talking about gene frequencies rather than a taxonomic scheme describing kinds of people. Ethnicity, on the other hand, refers to clusters of people who have common culture traits that they distinguish from those of other people. An ethnic group are people who share a common language, geographic locale, or place of origin, religion, sense of history, traditions, values, beliefs, food habits, etc. Ethnic groups do not have fixed and bounded entities, or are not fixed and bounded entities, and they do not include physical characteristics. From the perspective of anthropology, race is bad biology. Anthropologists argue that people are categorized by race because of social constructions. So in other words, there's no biological basis of race. So certainly we know that races are very real in many different aspects of our lives. However, the race concept, as many people understand it, is based on ideas that are simply wrong. The genetic conception of race began in the mid-20th century and remains a working hypothesis for some scholars. Some geneticists suggest that all humans are 99.9% alike, and there's difficulty actually recognizing race in genes because we're so genetically similar. So yeah, that is, and it's true. That's what they have found, and I'll show you an example here in a moment. So this idea of race is actually based on three misconceptions. So we know that humans differ from each other and that these differences can sometimes map onto geography. But does that necessarily mean that humans can be classified into races? The answer from a biological perspective is no. Certainly, races are very real in many different aspects of our lives. However, the race concept, as many understand it, is based on three ideas that are simply wrong. First, many people think that all humans can be naturally divided and categorized into distinct races. This is simply not correct, since all humans, yes, all humans, share genes with individuals from all over the world, and no race of humans is genetically distinguishable from any other race of humans. Second, there is the unfortunate and incorrect idea that races differ from one another genetically, and those differences cluster in a way that knowing about an individual's quote-unquote race can tell you other things like their IQ or their temperament. While things such as intelligence and personality most certainly have genetic components, they don't cluster with an individual's race any more than height, weight, or singing ability do. Finally, there is a misguided notion that differences between so-called races are because of our biological heritage, not cultural differences. We call African Americans and European Americans different races because of the color of their skin, but call Serbs and Croats of the former Yugoslavia different ethnic groups because of their differences are supposedly only cultural. These are all misconceptions and render the term race meaningless in biology. Races are often categorized based on one phenotype, skin color. So let's discuss that. If race is biologically meaningless, why do people around the world have different skin colors? Shown here is a map of the different skin colors around the world, with red indicating the darkest skin individuals and white the lightest skin individuals. First, notice that the regions grade into one another such that it would be impossible to easily cluster people into different racial categories based solely on the color of their skin. In fact, if we choose a different phenotype like height or hair color or the ability to digest lactose, we'd get a completely different pattern of individuals similar to one another and different from one another. The genetic map from earlier, or the genetic map in your book, showed that the different migration patterns of humans from north to south, east to western Africa. So an individual from northern Europe is genetically more similar to someone from India than two Africans are to each other, even though the two Africans are considered the same race. So race does not map onto genetic differences between populations and therefore has little value as a scientific concept. If races were real, it would be easy to cluster people into categories based solely on their DNA. The top graph illustrates an attempt to do this. On the left, the DNA of people from Western Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, and East Asia are plotted, and what emerges are, in fact, distinct groupings. Does this mean that races are real? No. The reason is that not everyone can be categorized into these three arbitrary groups. What about the rest of the planet? For instance, if we add people in from South India, the separation between Western Europeans and East Asians vanishes. Adding in people from the Middle East and North Africa would do the same for the separation between Africa and Europe and Asia. Notice in the graph below that when we plotted genetic difference versus geographic difference in humans, there is an unbroken line connecting all people. If races were real, there should be large clusters in this graph, but there are not. To construct races, we have to arbitrarily choose a category and then arbitrarily place certain individuals into those categories. Let's look at some of these arbitrary categories and see how they're misleading. In Brazil, people are categorized based on the color of their skin, the morphology of their lips and eyes, and their hair type. There is prejudice against people classified as black, resulting in, among other things, black Brazilians earning less money on average than those classified as white. Most would think that the black Brazilians come from the coast of Africa, where their ancestors were captured for the slave trade and brought to Brazil, and the white Brazilians are European, having come from Portugal. Researchers tested these ideas by extracting DNA from individuals from the coast of Africa and from Portugal and comparing their genotypes to individuals in Brazil categorized as black, white, and intermediate based on their hair, lips, eyes, and skin color. The results were striking. There were no meaningful genetic differences at all between Brazilians categorized as black or white. If all we had was the DNA, we would not be able to categorize these individuals into the arbitrary categories that the Brazilian culture has created. I want to add, though, that racial health disparities do exist and they deserve our attention. So we have created the social construction of race. And because of that, it has led to people getting treated differently because of their skin color. So there's kind of these two camps. One is that there's this race as a natural biological division for humankind, which anthropologists completely have disproven. And there's this other notion that race is a sociocultural phenomenon that has biological consequences, which is definitely the case. So in research that looks at Black Americans versus white Americans, this research has found that there are differences in the primary causes of death. So in this study that was conducted a long time ago, but still holds true today, the primary causes of death that were associated with race among Black Americans were homicide, HIV, hypertension, and diabetes. The health disparities research has found are caused by systemic racism, where in different institutions, Black Americans are treated differently than white Americans, leading to these poorer health outcomes, and also social racism as well. Outside of the United States, we have another example of racism and how this can impact health and mortality. So in Tanzania, there's high rates of albinism. So albinism is the absence or defect of tyrosinase, which is an enzyme responsible for producing melanin. So the question is, how can skin color be maladaptive or lead to these different mortality outcomes? So in Tanzania, albino killings are very high. They're the highest anywhere else in the world. So one reason why people with albinism are killed is because sorcerers will kill them and use their body parts to make magic. So that's one cause of death. However, the physiological cause of death of being having albinism is that it can lead to higher rates of skin cancer. And in regions where they don't have access to proper medical care, this can lead to a higher death rate than people without it. So you can see how the social consequences of racism leads to the killings of people with albinism, but that is different than the physical morbidities associated with this condition. So that leads to a final question of why do people have different skin colors? So skin color is not about race. It's about how close our ancestors lived to the equator. Within the time frames of hominid lifespans and dispersals, solar regimes have been in flux. Lighter-skinned individuals who have children near the equator run the risk of having children with health issues because the UV rays can deplete folate, a vitamin necessary for infant health, whereas darker-skinned individuals who live in reduced sunlight run the risk of getting rickets because of vitamin D deficiency. So your blank is UV radiation. UV radiation has been a potent and creative force in the evolution of life on Earth. Organisms have evolved a range of defenses against specific UVR wavelengths. Naked skin was a primary interface between the human body and solar radiation throughout most of the history of the genus Homo. UVA is plentiful and penetrates the dermis of skin. As humans dispersed away from the tropics into southern Africa and out of Africa entirely, they entered regions with lower annual UVR and significantly different seasonal mixtures of UVA and UVB. UVA rays penetrate further into the skin than UVB rays, steadily destroying key substances in the skin that give it its firmness and elasticity. UV rays are a leading cause of wrinkles and a cause of or major contributor to every type of skin cancer. Reduced UVB levels generated a positive selection for depigmentation, so lighter skin. And tanning, or having darker skin, is an adaptation to seasonally high UVR. Human skin derives most of its pigmentation from melanin. Human skin contains two types of melanin found in all animals, or mammals, the brownish-black eumelanin and the reddish-yellow pheomelanin. Higher concentrations of eumelanin characterize darker skin phenotypes, including tanned skin. Concentrations of pheomelanin in the skin vary considerably from individual to individual within any given group, but pheomelanin-rich skin phenotypes are more common among red-haired Northern Europeans as well as East Asians and Native Americans. So that wraps up the lecture for today, or for this chapter.